80s and had experienced some pretty amazing natural and cultural wonders during that time. And he amassed some unbelievable literature about the tours. So I owe much of what I know from Woody Mills and his experiences out on the Elizabeth Islands. He's a Wampanoag ancestor, and he had a lot of information about Native American culture out there, as well as natural history that he amassed from being an expert birder. So this is a virtual tour. I wish I could be out there with you. There is a possibility that we'll be able to do a few trips to the Elizabeth Islands this September. We're waiting to see if we can get clearance from the Board of Selectmen at Cuttyhunk due to the new normal, and also hoping that we can get the word out to accumulate enough registrants to justify doing the trip. Normally we do 8 tours a year out to the Elizabeth Islands from Falmouth Marina. These are day-long tours, and they really get you immersed into all the different experiences, the smells, the amazing visuals, and then the tastes, in fact, because we have an opportunity on Cuttyhunk to spend some time and really get to know the ways there, including visiting the Cuttyhunk Sea Farms, getting some oysters on the half shell, some clam chowder, ice cream. So I strongly encourage you to go on one of these tours with us. The Buzzards Bay Coalition also offers tours out to the Elizabeth Islands. They just recently acquired 85 acres of land, so we're not the only way to get out there. But I should say that there is no public transportation from Cape Cod to the Elizabeth Islands. You can only get there from New Bedford via the Cuttyhunk ferry, which leaves back and forth occasionally. So with that, I just want to launch into it. We can head off to the first slide. Peter, that'd be great. So people can see that slide now? They can? Great. Okay. So what you're looking at on this very first slide is just an aerial view, probably taken with a drone recently, of Cuttyhunk Island in the foreground and Nashawena Island just directly behind it. And that is the beautiful harbor or marina of Cuttyhunk that you're seeing there, that expansive blue mass. It looks like a lake in the middle. And then you can see off to the right-hand side a view of downtown Gosnold city center with a massive population of 120 registered voters, about 10 year-round residents, and blossoming up to many hundreds on a normal summer. When we go there in September on Labor Day, we usually are amongst about 700 people that are on island with at least 100 boats that are in the marina. So very seasonal, not that dissimilar to Cape Cod. Once you pass through early October, it's Cricketville, tumbleweed, nothing out there. In fact, my first trip out to Cuttyhunk was in November over Thanksgiving. I just wanted to go out and do some scouting. And I think I was one of 5 people on the island, and the others were swinging a hammer on a roof. So that was quite an experience. I really had no idea just how small the place is and just how tied they are to their history. Change is not something that is welcomed at Cuttyhunk, and you'll hear a little bit about that as we go. All right, so let's go to the second slide. Oh, do I do that? Oh, the remote, okay. I may need some assistance to get to the second slide. Oh, there we go, I pushed the wrong arrow. Okay, so this is just obviously a broad view to get you familiar and orient yourselves. We know what this is. This is the edge of Cape Cod. This is South Coast, Massachusetts. Here's Buzzards Bay, of course, and here is Vineyard Sound and Nantucket Sound. All right, so we're all oriented, and this is the Elizabeth Islands. And they start at Woods Hole and they run 14 miles all the way out to the tip of Cuttyhunk Island. And you can't see it on this map, you'll see in an upcoming map that is a smaller island just off the tip of Cuttyhunk, and that's Pennakees. So let's go look through what we got here. We've got Woods Hole right here. Then we've got Uncatina Island, and then Noshawn, which is the 3rd largest island around us in the Cape and Islands, 3rd to Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. This is an 8-mile long island. Then we've got Little Pask Island right here. Robinson's Hole separates Noshawn from Pask. And then we have Nashawina, separated by Quixhole right here. And then we've got Cuttyhunk at the very, very end. And then, of course, Penakees. I can give you a little information about Nashan. Again, this is the third largest island here on the Cape and the Islands, 8 miles long. There are 30 homes on the island. Most of them are on the north end, except for a little farmhouse on Tarpaulin Cove, which is right here. And we're going to talk about the famous Tarpaulin Cove as we go along. History of ownership. The Bowden family owned this island for about 100 years. And then when their last heir died, it was purchased by the Swain family. And then along came John Murray Forbes of Milton, Mass., who married into the Swain family. And in 1843, he bought the island from them for ... I'm not going to tell you. Think about it and guess what you think he paid for the third largest island on the Cape and the Islands back in 1843. And we'll answer the question at the end of the presentation. Suspense is killing me. So Forbes, John Murray Forbes, was a wealthy China merchant and a railroad builder. And Forbes left Nashan in trust to be administered by his 5 children as trustees for the benefit of his lineal descendants. And today, the Forbes family still owns and manages not only Nashan Island here, but the entire chain with the exception of Cuttyhunk and Penakees. So they own Nashan, Unkatina, Pask, and Nashawina, all in trust. Cuttyhunk is the town seat, if you will, owned by the town, by the state. And then of course, Penakees also owned by the state of Massachusetts. It's a wildlife sanctuary, and we'll talk about that. So the Forbes family have their own private ferry, which runs between Woods Hole and Hadley Harbor. You might have seen it. It's called the Cormorant, cute little thing. The Forbes family are very cautious about publicity and visibility, very conservative in the way they manage their islands. They stay out of the limelight. They're also somewhat concerned about, minor looting and vandalism. You can imagine that could be a problem in the summertime with lots of tourists and boaters. They have large billboards, 20-foot long billboards that say, stay off the island, but you're welcome to go to the beaches. Beaches like Tarpaulin Cove and Kettle Cove are open to visitors, but the interior is not. And they actually patrol the interior by horseback. One of the Forbes family members that I'm sure you all know is John Forbes Carey. So that's the lay of the land. Here's a close-up now of the Elizabeth Islands. It gives you a little bit more of a taste. God, I wish I was out there. This is really hard to do, sitting here. We all want to be out there right now. So again, you take a look. This is Little Unkatina. This is Woods Hole. And just off the map over here would be Woods Hole itself. Here's Nashan. Here are the little holes. And the name hole came from British explorers, including folks like Bartholomew Gosnold, who we'll talk about, who described these narrow passageways as a hole. So this is a British term that was carried over to the New World upon exploration. And these holes are very treacherous. And we'll learn a little bit about the merchant and whaling shipping that took place in this region and why it was so treacherous. But suffice to say, this is a very difficult place to navigate. And the weather and the sea conditions on Vineyard Sound can be completely different than Buzzards Bay on the same day. So again, here's Cuttyhunk at the very tip. Here is Penakees. These are 2 islands that you can go to publicly. These 3 islands you cannot. They're part of the Forbes Family Trust. Moving right along. Okay, so this is a great story. This is a drawing, a painting. I wish I knew the author. I apologize. You can find images of this all across the web. But this is representing Wampanoag lore. Of course, the Native Americans called the Elizabeth Islands their home and took advantage of all the amazing resources out there, including unbelievable fishing, shell fishing, and lots of natural resources that they would utilize during the summer months. The Wampanoags primarily spent their winter months on the islands, Cape Cod, and on the South Shore, but they've made forays out to the Elizabeth Islands to take advantage of all the wealth and riches that they could get out there. And the lore about how the Elizabeth Islands were formed from the perspective of the Wampanoags goes like this. So here is the representation of the lore. His name is Moshop, and Moshop was a giant, as you can see. And here are the Wampanoags over here. The Wampanoags were constantly being pestered by these little people called the Pukwudgies. And the Wampanoags enlisted the giant Moshop and his 3 children to help rid these Pukwudgie nuisances from the Wampanoags' existence. And Moshop enlisted his 3 sons to try to squelch the Pukwudgies, but unfortunately the Pukwudgies or Moshop, I should say, was no match for the Pukwudgies, and the Pukwudgies shot their little arrows, the same arrows that they were using to poke holes in the Wampanoags' canoes and just be a nuisance. They shot arrows at his sons and killed all of their sons. Moshop then in turn buried his children, and the burial grounds of his children now represent each of the islands along the Elizabeth Island chain. And that's the lore of the Wampanoag as to how the Elizabeth Islands were created. So again, the Indians of Nashan were members of the Wampanoag tribe, which lived around Buzzards Bay, as I had mentioned. Many of the Indian names are still in use today, and Indians gave names to places that related to some attribute or maybe to people. So the Indian name for this group of islands was called Nashanau, which means island between Buzzards Bay and Vineyard Sound. Gosnold's term Elizabeth Islands, of course, now names the whole group, but these were the Wampanoags' names. The Indians called Nashan Island Katamyuk, which means great fishing place. So you get the idea. But many of the names that still stand today are derived, anglicized derivations of the Wampanoag names, and they often have to do with great fishing places or the land next to the great fishing place. Fishing was an unbelievable part of their existence. So this is the story of the Wampanoag's creation of the islands, and then of course we have the story, the geological story of how the islands were created. And this is also very interesting. So here you can see Cape Cod right here with the hook going all the way up to Provincetown, okay? And these overlays represent the Laurentide ice sheet, which made its way down from Laurentide up to the north 20,000 years ago and extended as far south as the Elizabeth Island chain and Martha's Vineyard. This is the maximum extension of the glacier, Laurentide, 20,000 years ago. And the height of the ice over Cape Cod 20,000 years ago would have been about 1,500 feet, just to give you an idea of how huge a glacier we're talking here. The glacier was so enormous that it drew down the ocean sea level by 300 feet. And it was so enormous that up in New Hampshire, the White Mountains would have been completely covered by the ice. So think of a huge bulldozer coming down from the north and pushing rubble with it as it made its way south to Cape Cod. All this rubble ended up being deposited as these huge glacial erratics, but also as these large moraines, which are ridges or mountain ranges. And there are, as you can see on this image, there are 3 moraines. There's a moraine that runs right here, or a lobe, they call it, that runs right here. It's called the Buzzards Bay Moraine. There is another moraine or lobe that runs right down the middle of Cape Cod along the Cape Cod Highway, right? Route 6. And then there's a third lobe, the South Channel lobe or moraine that runs up through Chatham and Orleans. So just think of these as the furthest extent of the glacier right here. And this next image shows Cape Cod as we know it today. So 20,000 years ago, Cape Cod would not have looked at all like this. In fact, it wasn't until about 14,000 years ago that Cape Cod took on the land shape that we see today. And it's a result of the melting of the glacier, the increased rise of the sea level. In fact, during the peak of the glaciation, you could look out at continental shelf from Martha's Vineyard south, and you could have looked 30 miles of tidal flats, basically, when the sea level was drawn down 30 feet. So here we are today, and this is what you see. Again, the Buzzards Bay Moraine right here, which now created the Elizabeth Islands. And of course, this is the Sandwich Moraine. You may have questions about this later. If you were ever wondering how the 200 some freshwater ponds on Cape Cod were created? Well, they were all created during this last glaciation. So again, if you think about a huge bulldozer moving down through our region and bringing with it chunks of ice and large boulders, well, think of a large chunk of this glacier getting buried by glacial sediments. And then ultimately, as the climate warmed, melting took place, and it ended up creating a kettle lake or a kettle pond. So every pond we see on Cape Cod, not only is it formed from the last glaciation, but it's a lens of fresh water that we see today. When you look at a lake, you're looking at our drinking water. We share one large aquifer on Cape Cod. And that's really important to remember when we think about polluting our waters or eutrophication of our waters through excessive nutrient loading. So that's how our kettles were made. And then you can see these marks, these signatures of the Laurentide by walking through the woods. Every time you see a kettle pond or a vernal pool, such as this here on Nashon Island, a beautiful kettle pond on Nashon Island, you can thank the Laurentide. When you see massive glacial erratics in the woods, if you're walking out in West Barnstable Conservation Area or anywhere else, you'll see these random glaciers. Those were brought from Maine by the Laurentide. And this one here is a large glacial erratic right along the shore of Penakees. It's probably about 30 by 20 in feet, and it's a great roosting spot for cormorants, as you can see there. As you make your way out along the Elizabeth Island chain by boat, you'll notice these massive glacial erratics spewing all along the shoreline. And then you'll see them on the islands themselves as all part of this massive moraine that was left behind by the glacier. So let's go a little bit cultural now. And this is information that's relatively new to me, but I dug this out when I was giving a presentation for the Maritime Conference at the Museum of Natural History last year that talks a little bit about the Revolutionary War and the role that the Cape and Islands had in it. I wasn't aware that one of the first shots heard around the world came from sea during the Revolution. And here you can see the first sea fight of the War of the Revolution, Captain Jeremy O'Brien and the ship Unity. So back in those days, there were all sorts of ships that were commissioned by different countries around the world. And these ships were called privateers, or shall we say the captain of the ship was a privateer. So a privateer is basically a person or a ship that engages in maritime warfare under commission of war. And since robbery under arms was a common aspect of seaborne trade back in those days, this was able to be a merchant ship carrying arms, that image that you're seeing there. So a sovereign or a delineated authority would issue these commissions, also referred to as a letter of marque, during wartime. And the commission empowered the holder to carry on all forms of hostility permissible at sea by the usage of war. So basically it's a license to go to war. And this included attacking foreign vessels, taking them as prizes, taking prize crews and prisoners for exchange, capturing ships, and so on and so forth. It was licensed, but of course it was not well controlled. So as a result of this sort of activity, there started to arise issues of piracy. So privateering was legal, but it bordered on piracy. So the commission that was granted to these ships usually protected privateers from accusation of piracy, but in practice, the historical legality and the status of privateers could be very vague. And depending on the specific sovereign and the time of period, commissions might be issued hastily, and then privateers might take actions beyond what was authorized. And this is kind of what was happening with William Kidd and Captain Pound, who both found a lot of wealth and then ultimately demise throughout this period of time due to privateering. So on Nashon Island during the Revolutionary War, there were many small skirmishes between Minutemen from Falmouth and the British. And this was in 1975 when this all began to happen. And in fact, 1976, troops from the British warship Falkland raided Nashan. The American Revolution, it turns out, did not spare Nashan, and it didn't spare Falmouth. Mrs. Bowden, who was one of the members of a family that resided out on the Elizabeth Islands, wrote to the Committee of Safety to report the landing on the island of 100 armed men from British sloop of war, Falkland, who abused the inhabitants, stole their boats, and made off with sheep, cattle, and a large quality and quantity of food. And as a result, a company of militia from Falmouth, some 100 men or so, armed with muskets and small cannons, were sent to the island to defend themselves. And again, many skirmishes took place in and around Nashan Island, especially at Tarpaulin Cove, which is where this image was taken. This is the farmhouse at Tarpaulin Cove that dates back to this time, and old barns. And of course, many livestock were kept there. And the British troops would come to not only raid, cause havoc, but also to steal livestock, which were very, very valuable to help feed the soldiers. So there was a lot of activity during the Revolutionary War right here in our backyard in Falmouth and around Nashan Island that most people aren't aware of. And due to the ever increasing amount of coastwise shipping, much of it passing through Vineyard Sound, Nantucket Sound, and Buzzards Bay, with valuable cargoes from the West Indies, it was inevitable that pirates and privateers would attempt to attack and seize them. And again, two of the most famous, perhaps the most successful, were Thomas Pound and William Kidd, whose exploits we all have heard about. But they and numerous others were continually in and out of Tarpaulin Cove on Nashan Island, from which they made forays on passing ships. And legend has it that Captain Kidd left a small packet of goods at Tarpaulin Cove on Nashan Island. But if so, it's never been found or come to light. And that was the last port of call before Kidd sailed to Boston, where he was taken prisoner, and from which he was taken to England, where it is said he was hanged. So this is another piece of maritime history that I find really, really interesting. And if you have a chance to get out with us on this tour, you'll learn a lot more about that maritime history. You get a sense just from this image here, just how windswept these islands are. And if you were there back in the 1700s, there would have been virtually no trees in and around Tarpaulin Cove. I'm going to skip past this. This is just another story related to the British coming to seize livestock from Falmouth along Shore Drive, and they were confronted by militia that were tipped on the arrival of the soldiers and managed to thwart the British invasion there of Falmouth. And this is just an image of British foraging, as they said, at Little Harbor, Woods Hole. So Tarpaulin Cove is an amazingly beautiful spot. You saw the image earlier of the farmhouse. It also has a lighthouse, which is very, very famous. The lighthouse at Tarpaulin Cove that stands today was built in 1891, but the original lighthouse was built in 1759 by Zacchaeus Lambert, who donated the light and the whale oil to honor all of the Nantucket whalesmen that would pass in and out of this site. So Tarpaulin Cove back in the day of merchant shipping and whaling was a really convenient port that allowed sailors to take a rest. And so there was a general store, you could purchase milk and groceries there. There was a post office there. It was a regular fishing and sailing village. And if you go there today, it's just this quaint little cluster of two homes and a sandy beach. You would never know that there was that kind of activity there. There would be upwards of 100 ships moored or anchored in Tarpaulin Cove during the time. And what they were looking to do, aside from taking a break, was waiting for favorable winds. Tarpaulin Cove was a great spot in between the whaling ports of Nantucket and New Bedford, in which to wait wait out and wait for the winds. And as I mentioned, it was also a great spot for privateers and pirates, knowing that there was all sorts of shipping coming through this area, many of which was coming from the West Indies, with all sorts of jewels and spices. So in terms of lighthouses, again, the one at Tarpaulin is the 4th oldest in the United States for those lighthouse buffs. The oldest being in Boston, 2nd oldest being in Nantucket, and the 3rd oldest being in Rhode Island. So again, lots of legacy here at Tarpaulin Cove for a little place. So let's talk a little bit about some of the natural history on the Elizabeth Islands now. What you're looking at here is an old carriage road on Noshawn Island with clusters of beech trees growing around them. And I'm going to show you some slides. I was fortunate enough to get out to Noshawn. I was invited by a resident there, a Forbes family member, back in 2010, just to explore and learn a little bit about the place. And I was greeted by some unbelievable forests. If you walk to the north end of Noshawn, you'll stumble across really one of the only old growth forests in our entire region. Because the island was under private ownership, they were able to control logging, which was rampant across the Cape and the islands, right? People were using trees for shipbuilding and for fence building and homes, and an enormous amount for burning to keep yourself warm. And of course, the Sandwich Glass Works was using lots and lots of wood to create their glass. So most of the Cape, if not all of the Cape and the islands, was completely denuded of trees, with the exception of this small area on Noshawn, on the north end of Noshawn, which is very, very famous now. So famous, in fact, that Henry David Thoreau made a trip out there in 1859, where he had an opportunity to write a little bit about what he saw out there. Henry David Thoreau went out on the steamer Eagle's Wing in 1856. And in his June 27th journal entry, he writes about the Elizabeth Islands being, quote, mostly bare, except the east end of Noshawn. He says, I had some 2.5 hours out there, and I was surprised to find such a noble and primitive wood, chiefly beech trees, and and oaks, such as the English poets celebrate, and large spreading tupelos. This is one of the large beech trees that apparently had fallen. This is the main tree that had fallen, and then you see these outgrowths, sort of suckers, that ended up becoming their own trees. And this is called a nurse tree. And this is something you might see if you walk through the woods, a tree that has fallen that is then allowed for suckers to turn into their own individual trees, and the main tree serves as a nurse to those. Some of these other images here of this beech forest are just amazing. These trees are so old that they've become all gnarled and mangled, showing all sorts of hollow features, birds nesting inside of these large beech trees. I've never seen beech trees so stately. I feel like Thoreau being out there. It was really astounding. This is another huge beech tree that's so old, it's starting to list over to the side. It's lost a lot of its branches. The understory of this beech forest is totally open, so you can walk through anywhere. There's no greenbrier or thorns to get you. It's a true old growth forest, and it's the only one of its kind left in the region. And I wish that there was a way for more of us to actually experience this without doing damage to the site. This is an enormous oak tree with a massive gall growing on it. It was out in the middle of the forest. Look at that. I've never seen anything like it. Elephantitis of the oak. And then look at this one. This is a hollowed out, looks like it was burned, and it's twisted. So the trunk is twisted. I mean, I've just seen trees that you don't see anywhere else. So that was a really wonderful experience. All right, moving right along. Let's talk a little bit about Penakees now. We were talking about Noshawn. Let's talk Penakees. This is a tiny island with a big punch to it. It's only 75 acres in size, very, very small, but it has an amazing storied cultural and natural history. I thought we'd just go through the chapters, and I'll kind of rip through this quickly, but it will give you a sense as to how much has occurred over time on this island. So let's start way back, right? Back during pre-explorer periods, where Wampanoags were spending great deals of their lives out on these islands, including Pennakees. This would be a Wampanoag wigwam that you could have witnessed out on the Elizabeth Islands, or a small settlement of Wampanoags. And as I mentioned earlier, they came out to the islands to take advantage of the amazing resources, especially the fishing and shellfishing. They would take dugout canoes and they would travel between the islands. Today, you can still find remnants from these settlements. There are areas where you can see prickly pear, which is now an endangered species of plant in Massachusetts, that are evidence of a settlement. And the Wampanoags used to take advantage of prickly pear as a food item. And they would leave seeds, and they have since sprouted and they've persisted. You'll see axes, you'll see arrowheads at various locations. There was an axe found in Pennakees Harbor about 15 years ago. Moving along in the history of Pennakees, of course, European settlers arrived in the early 1600s, and they were utilizing these islands primarily for livestock, mostly sheep herding. So for 1641 to 1867, thereabouts, most of the islands were under ownership by Europeans, but some Wampanoag presence still persisted there in tandem with the Europeans. And these farmers, again, not only livestock, they were growing some vegetables, but it was very limited. It was really mainly sheep. This is just a really bucolic photo. I love this photo here. This is credit to the Falmouth Historic Society. So then we get into a really amazing and very, very brief chapter of Pennakees. You can see 1867 to 1880. Very short chapter, but a lot happened. So this story has to do with an individual named Mr. Anderson, who was from New York City. He wanted to come to Pennakees to spend his summers, and he built a small home. And as he was visiting one year, he went off island to Harvard Museum, and he met Louis Agassiz, shown here, who at the time was running the zoology department at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. And he befriended Louis, and they got to talking, and Mr. Anderson realized that Louis Agassiz had always had a dream to open up a teaching institute somewhere in New England to focus on marine ecology. He wanted to open up a state-of-the-art facility on Pennakees Island or somewhere on the Cape and the Islands that would allow him to teach teachers how to become marine biologists. And he wanted to have live creatures. He didn't want to just have stuffed specimens. He wanted to do something unique. And this is very unique for 1867. So Louis Agassiz asked Mr. Anderson if he would be willing to give him a $50,000 endowment to establish this teaching institute, which was called eventually the Anderson School. So Mr. Anderson agreed. He laid the foundation and the financial framework to establish this teaching institute. Louis Agassiz opened it up on his first year, 1869, I believe, after having built this really, really huge complex. Unfortunately, after the first full year of teaching, Louis Agassiz became ill and passed away. He asked his son if he'd be willing to take over for him as director of this institute, and his son was willing to do so for 1 year, but only 1 year. Things unraveled, and unfortunately, after 2 full years of this institution's functioning, it closed. So a very, very brief stint. But it did manage to fledge a whole new group of conservationists, including the founder of the Marine Biological Lab. So there's a great story behind the evolution of the Marine Biological Lab and Pennakees Island. So another chapter, this is a spooky chapter. And when we do our tours onto Pennakees Island, we managed to get out to the very northern tip of Pennakees to explore the leper colony and the leper cemetery. So leprosy back in the early 1900s was a very misunderstood disease. It had a huge amount of fear and loathing associated with it. And you can imagine why, because patients had very, very gruesome appearances. If that's not striking, I don't know what is, right? Look at that. Leprosy, as it was known then, Hansen's disease as it's known now, caused lesions of the skin, it caused blindness, and it even caused shrinkage of extremities like fingers, toes, ears, and nose. And when you're seeing someone that looks like this and you don't know what the disease is coming from or whether you are prone to contract it, you're very scared. And so this fear and loathing was so abundant that the state of Massachusetts was trying to find a way to isolate patients because, of course, there was no cure for leprosy at this time. And the state of Massachusetts decided they would hold a public hearing in Brewster to talk about the possibility of opening up a leprosarium on Cape Cod. You can imagine that didn't really go down all that well. And when the public hearing was announced, there were train loads of people. They had to add extra cars to the train from Boston to Cape Cod in order to accommodate all the people that wanted to go to this hearing. And as you can imagine, people were absolutely against the idea of having a leprosarium on Cape Cod. So the state had to go back to the drawing boards. And where did they choose? Well, find the most isolated place in the state that you could possibly find, and that was Penikese Island. So they opened up the state penitentiary. It felt like it. It really actually was a penitentiary in many ways because these patients were more like inmates. They were restricted to these locations. These were the inmates' quarters on Penikese. And they were divided from the staff's quarters by these pillars and a gate. And these pillars still stand today. They're very symbolic because they represent the safe zone bordering the infected zone. And you would not want to go from the safe zone beyond those two pillars into the infected zone under fear that you might contract this disease. And so what you're looking at here are images of, again, the patient's quarters and the laundry and the other facilities that were restricted solely to the doctor who was running the show there, a fellow by the name of Mr. Parker, and the patients. There were never more than 21 patients on island at any given time. Many of the patients that were on island spent most of their lives there. It was very, very upsetting. And they were buried there. They did not want to take any of the bodies off island. So if you go to the cemetery on the northern tip of Penikese today, you'll see some now famous or infamous patients, including these three here. These are lepers on Penikese, as you can see in the caption below. Left to right, Lucy Peterson, Goon Lee Dip, as his name was, with his homemade banjo, and then Mrs. Barrows. The significance of these two is that he lived on Penikese longer than any other patient and died there. And Mrs. Barrows gave birth, if you can imagine that, to a healthy son while on island as a leper. I don't know the story about this woman, Lucy Peterson, but these two tombstones can be seen on island. So it's a very moving experience, very spooky, and this is really just a primer for you all. You don't really get a sense of this until you get to the island and see it for yourself. But we do talk a lot about the leprosarium, and we do talk a lot about now, how that disease is unfurled. So leprosy now is known as Hansen's disease, and Hansen's disease is caused by a bacterium that it turns out only 5% of the world's population can even contract. So after all these years of fear and loathing and angst, and setting up a leprosarium out in the middle of nowhere, there was no need because the vast majority of people in this world can't even contract Hansen's disease or leprosy if they wanted to. It's just not possible. And today the disease is now under control. And it's again known as a bacterium. And you can only contract it if you have a faulty gene, one, and if you come in close contact with someone who has the contagious form of leprosy. So that's an amazing chapter. The next chapter runs from 1924 to present, and this is the chapter where Massachusetts takes ownership of Penikese Island to open up a bird sanctuary for this species here, the roseate tern. About a quarter of the Western Hemisphere's population of roseate terns resides in Buzzards Bay and Cape Cod. And on Penikese Island, there is a large roseate tern colony, as they're called, that consists of upwards of 70 or 80 pairs. The numbers fluctuate, and it's located out on a rocky bluff at the northeastern end of the island. These are least tern eggs. They nest like piping plovers right on the shoreline. And without human protection, the species would become highly imperiled and likely go extinct. So a lot of work is done by the state of Massachusetts to protect this roseate tern colony out on Penakees. Mass Audubon has a coastal waterbird program that spends a lot of time managing our beaches throughout the Cape and along the shore of Massachusetts to protect this endangered species, the roseate tern, and the piping plover. It's kind of hard being a tern these days because you run into predators such as raccoons that come to eat your eggs. This one has some eggs in its mouth. Domestic cats and other domestic animals are a major nuisance for these endangered shorebirds, as are black-backed gulls. We call them the living disposals, eat everything. Foxes that eat everything, coyotes that eat everything, crows that eat everything, and it goes on and on and on. What's basically happened is that humans have created a much more restricted available area for nesting. It's an indirect consequence of being a plover, is that humans have reduced the number of areas where these birds can now nest. And you can see some images of what used to be a piping plover's home, now a human's home. So humans are no longer really a direct issue. In other words, we're not running over nests anymore, and we're not actively taking eggs. That's under control, but we have a secondary effect, and that is that by using beaches, we're restricting the areas that these terns and plovers can nest, and into very small areas. Think of it like a buffet scenario where these birds now only have a small section of beach with which they can nest. And if a predator like a crow or raccoon or a coyote finds one or two nests, it's probably going to find a whole slew of nests. In fact, there's stories of coyotes going through a tern or a plover colony and eating 10, 15, 20 eggs per passing. So these are imperiled species, and we do a lot of work to protect them. And it just so happens that Penakees Island is one of the strongholds for the roseate tern right now. This is an image of a nest of eggs. I don't know if you can see it, but you can see how close a call it was for these. There's the nest right there. How close a call it was for these piping plover eggs. It just nearly got missed by an off-road vehicle. So this is, as I said up here, it's hard being a tern. So let's go to the next chapter. 1973 to present, there has been ownership by the Penakees Island School out on Penakees. And they built back in the early 1970s this facility here, which is the lodge or the campus headquarters for the school. And a fellow by Mr. Cadwallader opened up the Penakees Island School with the hope of rehabilitating juvenile delinquents. And many of the juvenile delinquents were from the neighboring city of New Bedford and other areas on southeastern Massachusetts. The state funded this operation. The goal was to bring troubled youth, boys exclusively, out to Penakees Island, to rehabilitate them, to get them away from all the troubles, to give them an experience of living sustainably with one another. You can see over here, the group is bringing an osprey pole out to set up on island. They worked in a farm, they had their own vegetables, they lived off the grid. And for years, the rate of recidivism was very, very low. This was functioning, but it was also extraordinarily expensive to maintain this facility year in and year out, especially on a deserted island. So recently, within the last 2 years, I believe, maybe a little off on this, the Penakees Island School and its work with rehabilitation and substance abuse has ceased. And the Penakees Island School now is focusing on utilizing this island and its facility here as more of an ecotourism destination for children. And Mass Audubon has been involved in bringing students out from various schools in our region, as has many other school districts and many other nonprofits. And it's wonderful for students to get out and experience all the things that we're talking about today, especially the natural history, and give them a sense of place and belonging here. And so we'll see what the next chapter of the Penakees Island School is, but right now it's really focusing on education and experiences for children, which I think is great. So we'll keep moving because I think, what time is it now? Yeah, we're gonna want to start wrapping up, but I do want to talk a little bit about Bartholomew Gosnold, Many of you are familiar with Bartholomew Gosnold. If you go down to Woods Hole, you'll see his statues. He was a British explorer, and he was commissioned by the Crown of England to make a trip to the New World. And he did this in 1602. And he steered his bark, a type of a ship called a bark, that was named the Concord. He steered this bark with 32 adventurous people. This was a very, very small ship. He steered it down to North Virginia in the spring of 1602. He made his way past Provincetown and then down to Martha's Vineyard along the way. He named Martha's Vineyard after the grapevines that he saw. He named the Elizabeth Islands after the Queen, we believe, Queen Elizabeth at the time. He went by the Gayhead or Quinnet Cliffs, and he called them the Dover Cliffs because it reminded him of the White Cliffs of Dover, obviously, back in England. And then he ultimately settled with his 32 mariners on Cuttyhunk and built a fort on the small island at the very west end of the island. That area is now called the West End. The small island of Cuttyhunk is completely surrounded by water, and perhaps Gosnold felt protected, and he thought this was a great place to set up a camp. And he was coming, of course, to trade with Native Americans and to bring back riches. In particular, one riches he wanted to bring back was sassafras, which was thought to have all sorts of medical cures and be an aphrodisiac, among other things. So Gosnold harvested 1 ton of sassafras while he was on Cuttyhunk, and he sold it in England for 20 shillings a pound, along with cedar, timbers, and furs that he collected. And the native Wampanoag people were welcoming to this small group, but there was a skirmish that ensued on Penakees one day that spooked both the Wampanoags and Bartholomew Gosnold's group. And as a result, Gosnold chose to abandon his small fort on Cuttyhunk and make his way back to England. So it was a very, very short-lived period of time, just a matter of months, a 3-week stay, in fact, not even a month, where Gosnold spent on Cuttyhunk. Some believe that Shakespeare was inspired to write the play The Tempest, based on the Cuttyhunk documentation kept by Gosnold's companions. And that's a little bit of unproven lore. But this image here by Albert Bierstad is of the west end of Cuttyhunk. And when you visit the island, you'll get an amazing view from Lookout Hill, which is right up here, down on the west end, which is where Gosnold had his fort. There's Gosnold's small park there. Today, there is a monument that was erected on the 300th anniversary of Gosnold's discovery of Cuttyhunk in 1602. And you can see that monument very clearly when you go there. And here's Gosnold's bark Concord there. Sailed from England, 1602, 32 crew and only 39-foot keeled ship. I can't imagine. And here again is the monument that was built in 1902 to celebrate Gosnold's discovery right there. And this is an old oil shed that was used to power a lighthouse that was located out at the site back when there was a life-saving station on Cuttyhunk. So the last slide I want to talk about here is, to leave you with, is going back to the natural history. There is a huge amount of rare wildlife on the islands, not just bird species like the tern, but all sorts of pollinator species that use the Elizabeth Islands as a stopover on their migrations. So monarchs, for example, make their way down along the Elizabeth Island chain on their southern migration. They'll stop along the way to refuel on the hordes and hordes of goldenrod that are available on islands starting August. So when we do our tours, you have an opportunity to experience the terns, you have an opportunity to experience lots of other migratory birds, but also on a good year, you might be lucky enough to see hundreds, sometimes thousands of monarchs passing along the islands. The islands are like an arrow pointing in the direction of the south. And it's not at all unusual for migratory species to use these land features as guides and navigational tools to get where they're going to go. there's also a large number of seals, which are not so rare anymore, right? They're the reason why we're seeing white sharks all the time these days. The population of gray seals on the Cape and the Islands has jumped from a roughly 19 individuals off Muskegon Island in the early 1990s to well over 70,000 or more seals in and around the Cape and the Islands today. And it's those seals that are attracting the sharks near shore and causing the problems that we saw 2 years ago. And of course, the other problem that happened up in Maine a couple of weeks ago. So when you come out with us, you'll have an opportunity to learn a lot more about endangered species. There is another species that is out on the island. What in the world is this? This is called a Scotch Highland cow. And it turns out that the trustees of Noshawn and the Elizabeth Islands take advantage of this domesticated cow, Scotch Highland cow, to help clear and maintain the fields with the goal of attracting pollinators like butterflies and other essential species that help retain that open grassland ecosystem. It's the open grassland ecosystems that are now the rarest type of ecosystem in all of New England. We have lots and lots of forests now. We don't have much in the way of open habitat. So the cows are year-round open grazers. They maintain that open habitat and prevent the succession of woody vegetation from coming in. So rare wildlife get help too from domestic animals. So this is the last slide here. Again, I'm gonna be determining in the next 2 weeks whether or not we can do Cuddy Hunk trips and Elizabeth Island tours this year. And so check in on our website in the next 3 weeks or so and take a look and see if we have any tours posted. We're gonna try to get a few. If we don't get any launched this year, I promise we'll be back running our tours next year. You have a chance to get out with me and Chris Walls, our property manager at Long Pasture, to go on one of these tours. I guarantee you'll have a blast. Now you might have questions about anything related to the Elizabeth Islands, and if you do, I guess I'll just go on to the chat and just see if there's anything that anyone has. I'm happy to answer questions about anything along these lines. Then you can probably correct me on some of my facts too. But thank you. If there are no questions, just in advance, thank you for spending almost an hour with me. And I hope you make it over to Long Pasture this summer. We're open, our trails are open. We have a visitor center tent that's being raised due to our strange new times to keep people outdoors. But if you do come to the sanctuary, you'll have a chance to see our new Discovery Center project. We're building a new building that will be done next April. And we're hoping to push the reset button in April once COVID washes through and welcome everybody to our brand new, fully accessible community center called the Discovery Center. So come by, stop by and say hi. And I don't see any questions so far, Pete. Anything coming in? Sorry? Oh, the purchase price. So if you're all thinking about it, what do you think? Maybe 100,000, maybe 200, no, $20,000 was the purchase price in 1857. Think about the cost of the value of Noshawn Island today. It's kind of hard to fathom something could go for that little. Yeah, $20,000. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. Hope you come to one of the next presentations here. And thanks, Anne, again for inviting me. Take care.